hello everybody, and welcome to the Meeting House, where we have conversation on religion and American life. I'm your host, Dr. Dwight A. Moody. Glad you stopped by today. My guest today is Dr. Joseph E. Early of Campbellsville University in Kentucky. He has written a fascinating book, Because of Eve, Historical and Theological Survey of the Subjugation of Women in the Christian Tradition. What a title. I've read the book. I've written a review of it. You can read my review on our website at themeetinghouse.net. And after that, or before that, I'll have the news. After that, I have a commentary dispersed throughout the whole show. I've got some really interesting music for you. But first of all, we want to welcome Dr. Early to the Meeting House today. Dr. Early, welcome to the Meeting House.
It is a pleasure to be with you today, Dr. Moody.
This is your first time here.
It is.
And we're going to talk to you about this fascinating book. That's a strong word, Subjugation.
It's a very strong word, but it is the most appropriate word.
We're going to talk about it.
That's why we used it.
I was really stunned by reading the book. You've read my review. You know how stunning I think it is. And we'll come back and talk about it in just a minute.
Yes,
I've got 5 news stories today, beginning in Birmingham, Alabama, and New York City. Baptist-affiliated Samford University in Birmingham and the Orthodox Jewish Yeshiva University in New York are both in the news this week for their respective handling of LGBTQ student organizations. Way out on the West Coast in Los Angeles, a Superior Court judge in Kern County, Florida, ruled that local authorities violated Kathy Miller's freedom of religion and speech by punishing her for refusing to design a cake for a gay wedding. And back on the East Coast from Washington, D.C., scholars with the Catholic University of America surveyed more than 10,000 Catholic priests all across the country. They issued their report that shows less than a quarter of the priests trust their own bishops in the handling of sexual abuse allegations. And then to Chicago, in the middle of the country, more than 400 people, mostly pastors and scholars, gathered on the outskirts of that great city to discuss how to rehabilitate their evangelical identity, given its recent identification with a political party, that is, Trumpian Republicanism. Out in Albuquerque, New Mexico, best-selling author and Catholic priest Richard Rohr is stepping away from leadership duties at his Center for Action and Contemplation, citing a recent cancer diagnosis. And finally, from Nashville, Tennessee, C.C. Winans was named Artist of the Year at the 2022 Dove Awards, sponsored by the Gospel Music Association. She is the first black artist to win this award. Let's take a break now and listen to C.C. as she sings some of her award-winning song. We'll be back in just a minute.
They say this mountain can't be moved. They say these chains will never break. But they don't know you like we do. There is power in your name. We've heard that there is no way through. We've heard the tide will never change. They haven't seen what you can do. There is power in your name. So much power in your name.
That was CeCe Winans singing her award-winning song, Believe for It, at the recent awards by the Gospel Music Association. She's the first black artist to win that Artist of the Year award. We're proud of her, glad to broadcast that piece of her singing. I'm Dwight A. Moody in the Meeting House, your host for our conversation on religion and American life. We're talking today with Dr. Joseph Earley. He's a professor of theology, church history, and ethics at Campbellsville University. Dr. Earley, that's a lot of stuff to know and teach.
As you well know, from schools our size, you have to wear a lot of hats.
You have to wear a lot of hats. When I was teaching, I had to teach a lot of courses. As you know, I'm sure you have to do that as well. You're the author of 8 books. This is your most recent, Because of Eve.
Yes, sir.
Why did you choose this title?
When it all comes down to it, a lot of it goes back to what the Apostle Paul said about Eve that has been quoted and misconstrued. So it's because of her that so many things have happened. So
even though, as you point out in your book, Eve plays a very minor role in the Hebrew Bible, Genesis to Malachi.
That is basically it. She is a very minor role. She stars in the first 5 chapters, much more than Adam does.
Right.
But she doesn't get any more mentions, and she doesn't get a mention again until the Apostle Paul.
Until the Apostle Paul. Does Jesus ever mention Eve?
No.
Isn't that interesting?
It is, yes.
I was so stunned by the quote after quote after quote from the Christian tradition denigrating women.
That is the standard all the way from Greco-Roman society through the Old Testament through probably yesterday afternoon, the last time I looked on the internet.
To yesterday afternoon. Isn't that for sure? And you quote people from the early church, people like Tertullian, who was specifically and terribly prejudiced against women. That's the way we would say it today, isn't it?
He's misogynistic without a doubt. He really did. He really is. So. And
he imbibed this from Greco-Roman culture, and how much of it was influenced by his own experience?
A lot of it would have probably been by his own experience. About the time Tertullian shows up is when you're starting to see some ideas that women are temptresses in Christian tradition, and you should stay away from the sexual sin in that manner, and especially in hardcore Carthage, where he had become so involved.
I was just surprised throughout the whole 2,000 years of Christian history how women are blamed for the sexual side of men's behavior, men's lust. It's all blamed on the women.
Yes, it is. Because Eve, and even though there's absolutely nothing in the Old Testament that says Eve tempted Adam, it was like she offered it and he took it. Somehow there was some kind of temptation, and women become known as temptresses. And until about the mid 19th century, women were seen as much more sexual and needing sex than men were. And then it kind of changed in the middle of the 19th century.
It kind of flipped, and now men are the sexually motivated ones, and the women have to say no to that.
Well, that, and also women are in about 1960s and 70s, particularly, women began to be blamed for tempting men. And we get into a bunch of the purity culture, and we tell women they need to completely and totally cover up. And you have girls in youth groups being told they can't wear a bathing suit when they swim, and don't tempt the boys, because obviously the boys can't handle it, which clearly shows that, in my opinion, men are a little bit weaker than women when it comes to this.
Now, Joseph, I know this was not part of your research, but I want to tell you, I've watched a lot of TikTok videos. And you can't believe how many of these TikTok videos feature women who grew up and were shaped by what you just called the purity culture.
Yes.
And they talk about the effect that this had on them. I know this is a whole different subject, and I should have a whole different show in the Meeting House about this. But the whole history in the Christian tradition, Tertullian, the great councils of the church, medieval with the great theologians, all justified keeping women disempowered and invisible.
As best they could, that was their plan.
They wanted the women to stay in the homes and not have any role in the church, certainly not in the worship services.
No, they absolutely did not. And that continues all the way from the early church, where there was the sin of original sin that scared them. And there's also one of the things that runs as a thread through there is that men have also had a great fear from the Old Testament all the way through of women the menstruation era. All the way through the early church, they believed that made women unworthy to take the Eucharist.
Right, and of course that is rooted in the scriptures where women were
yes.
considered unclean in the Hebrew culture.
Yes.
But you're saying that rolled over into Christian culture.
Well, Gregory the Great was writing about it all the way. Augustine of Canterbury wrote Gregory the Great about it in Rome, saying, should I keep these people, these women from taking it so they won't pollute the sacrament? And Gregory wrote back and he said, there's no problem, let them take it. It's just part of nature, which is shocking because that continues on through the medieval era where women were viewed that way. But women were even in the Catholic Church, women wanted to become monastics. And there was a fear that if they became monastics, and even they were rooted together in what were called double monasteries, they would tempt the men.
Yeah.
And that they might contaminate the Eucharist. So they had double houses and separated.
And by the double, you mean the men had their own house. They were confined there. The women had theirs, but the priest had to go over to the women's monastery to administer the Eucharist.
And there was many prayers for that priest so he would not be tempted by those female monastics, to make sure that he was not tempted by them. That was always the problem with the aspect of this, because women couldn't be ordained in the Catholic Church, and they still can't. And so in order to be near, to go over and serve them the Eucharist and give them the sacraments, you had to have someone ordained. And so a man, no matter how independent some of these women's monasteries were, a man still had to be present just to serve the sacraments.
In your research, Joe, what was the most shocking thing that you had to deal with or process?
The most shocking thing with me probably was when I figured out that most of the medieval era is clearly the worst. But when I found out, I began to notice that so many of the beliefs that we have about women that have been passed down to us as if they're scriptural actually come from Greek philosophy, Plato and Aristotle. Aristotle is just basically copied by Aquinas, and Plato by Augustine. And that's how it worked its way in, for women being weaker minded, having less souls, being temptresses, being less human, is what Aquinas would say via Aristotle. That was what really surprised me, is I assumed there would be a little bit more of the biblical grounding to these things.
But most of it was coming into the Christian tradition and the Christian practice of faith from secular culture.
Yes, it was. That was the way that women have been treated by Christianity. And by the way, Christianity treats women a whole lot better than many other religions do, including to this day. But the culture at the time was women should be at home. They should not speak. They should serve their husbands. They can go to worship, but they should be quiet. And they were seen as from Greco-Roman society, especially the Greek side, they were seen as just like children. Their minds were like children, and they had to be controlled. And so that is one of the reasons that it continues on and bleeds over into Christian history for 2,000 years.
Yes, I was really surprised at how women were consistently described as almost incapable of learning, as disinterested in learning or leadership, things that we take for granted now, that women are as teachable, as brilliant, and have as many gifts as men do in leadership. But throughout this whole literature that you reviewed, there was such disdain for the capacity of women to learn and to lead. This was shocking.
Yes, that is a strand that runs all the way from the beginning to the end. They just believe that women, for instance, the Puritan fathers, one of the Puritan fathers said a woman had died and went crazy and died because she had read too many books.
Yep.
And one of the reasons that Anne Hutchinson died, she was trying to teach men and she didn't have the mental capacity for it. So when she was killed by the Indians, that was God's justice. Women were not supposed to teach men, and that has been a consistent thread. It's
been a consistent all the way up to this very day. You said yesterday, today.
I was reading an article yesterday, catching up on a couple of things, and I was like, well, that train's never late.
That train is never late. It's right there. Well, we're talking with Dr. Joseph Earley, author of the new book, Because of Eve, Historical and Theological Survey of the Subjugation of Women in the Christian Tradition. We will be back in just a minute to continue our conversation with Dr. Earley.
For more than 116 years, Campbellsville University has been educating men and women to be the salt and light in the world. The mission of providing quality Christian education has never been more alive. In the spirit of the Great Commission, Campbellsville University has expanded its reach to multiple centers across Kentucky and into California and Ontario, Canada. CU offers certificate, associate, bachelor's, master's, and doctoral programs in a variety of formats to meet the individual needs of students. Campbellsville University of Theology offers a wide range of programs for aspiring theologians and those called to ministry, including a 2-year online Master of Divinity. To learn more about opportunities awaiting you at Campbellsville University, visit us at one of our locations or online at campbellsville.edu.
That was introducing Campbellsville University, where Dr. Earley teaches. I've been there many times, as you know, Joe.
You're a good friend of the university, sir.
That's right.
And you're a good defender of us on a couple occasions.
Yes, I have been. And I like going down there. I've been down there many times. As you know, I taught at Georgetown College, one of the great rivals in athletics, but one of the great partners with Campbellsville in educating young people around the state.
I love Georgetown College. It is event. Sheila Clomford was there. I mean, I have many friends at Georgetown. And of course, when I really liked Dr. Birdwis.
Yes.
And I found out he had actually passed at the Campbellsville-Georgetown game when I was up there and they said, we're going to have a moment of silence for Jack. And I was like, what?
Yeah.
And because I was going to go see him. I always go see him in that little orange section across from ours every game. And it was, he was a good man.
He was one of the great teachers, one of my closest friends on the faculty, had an office just straight above mine. I remember the day he died, Friday afternoon. Let me ask you this. Why did you write this book, Joe?
I had just finished my church history book that you've probably seen, and for Broadman Holman. And about 6 months later, I got itchy. I was like, I have to find something that I want to write. And it needs to be something that I can get my teeth in to do serious research. And one of my closest friends, Dr. Twyla Hernandez, our missions professor here at Campbellsville, we had a speaker come on campus, Dr. Mimi Haddad from Christians for Biblical Equality came. And I've always been an egalitarian, but I thought, well, let's go listen to her. She's, I know I'll learn something. She gave this wonderful lecture. And in it, she really didn't tell me anything that I didn't know, but I didn't know how it all fell together, the way that she wove it together and demonstrated clearly how it has just flown all the way from the beginning to where it is now. And I was enthralled. And I came home and I sat down with my wife on the patio and she said, well, how was it? And I described it to her after a good hour description of it to her. She said, well, there's your book. And then I looked back over my life and started thinking, what have I noticed about how women have been, treated in churches? I had never seen a woman pray in my home church out loud after I thought about it for a while, but I always saw them cleaning up and cooking. When I did my master's degree at Midwestern Seminary, There were 2 or 3 women. I'm sure there were more, but there was 2 or 3 women I remember, and they looked terribly uncomfortable. Professors called their wives "my good wife," and I was like, "Is that Puritan? Are we doing this?" And women were, and it was back when the first time in the SBC they started pressing complementarianism really hard, and Calvinism for that way. I didn't follow either one, and and I started thinking about these things. And I thought, I really want to investigate this. And I don't want this to be a superficial book where I just come out and talk about a few things. I want to know it all. So that's about pretty much how it happened.
Well, I'll tell you, I've looked at the bibliography that you put in your book. It's quite extensive. The material
Yes.
that you research. I don't know how many pages it is, maybe 20 or 30 pages of bibliography.
Well, as a college professor and a scholar like you are, sir, you know that you want someone to read your book, but you also want them to follow that footnote to the bibliography and to go read it for themselves. It took me 5 years to research this book, and that's with a year sabbatical. So I did all that, and I just wanted to make sure it was comprehensive. I will say this: what is the old saying? Your eyes are bigger than your stomach.
Mm-hmm.
This was too big, but it took me 7 complete years to do it.
Wow.
But there were I purchased personally over 250 books for this.
250 books. How many, who do you think is going to read this book, Joe?
Right now, it seems to be selling pretty well. I think people who are egalitarian will want to read it. I think people scholars who just want to know about history. I have several friends that within the SBC that are more conservative than me, and they've already purchased it. And like, I just can't. And they wanted to read the stuff on the medieval period or the patristic era to see how it all came together. So even though I come from the egalitarian side, complementarians will read it as well. And I'm sure I will get some pretty interesting reviews from the complementarians.
Well, I read on Facebook, I think your wife posted my review and said it was the first review of your book. And that makes me proud. And of course,
I'm very happy it was you, sir.
And of course, it's an excellent book for the classroom, both at the college and seminary level, and because it is so comprehensive and it is simple to read. You untangle a great deal of the complicated things in our intellectual history as Christians, and you put it out there where lay people can understand it, read it, comprehend it, debate it, imbibe it, and believe it.
Yes. I wanted to make it available as well as I could to a general person that's gone to church. They have to know a little bit before they can pick it up and read it and understand what's going on. But mainly it's written for undergraduate and graduate school. There are several schools right now that are going through the adoption process that have already told me that they are arguing it out in their committee meetings, what can be used. And I'm using it here next semester in my Christian theology class because after I wrote my book and I looked back at my lectures, I realized how woefully inaccurate it is and incomplete without women. I use McGrath's book, and it's an excellent book, but it does not include women as much as it should.
Well, we certainly need it today. We've already talked a little bit about the debate that's going on in all of the denominations, in the Catholic Church and all Protestantism. One of the most fascinating things I think about the contemporary debate about it, and you point this out in the book, how the whole Pentecostal movement started out, people like Amy
McPherson,
yes, who were empowering women in every capacity, and how that has slowly been tapped down in the Pentecostal culture. I think this is one of the most fascinating dynamics of modern American religious history.
There is a desire to fit in with the larger church society or the culture. You see that early on with Christianity having to fit in. When Jesus didn't return the next day, as Paul seemed to think he would in 1 Corinthians, Paul seemed to think we better fit in with the Roman Empire. And so there's a little women stuff going on there. And you notice that before the beginning of the 19th century, women in the Baptist church, Shibboleth Stearns' wife, all these people all preached. And the Methodist church, they even drew back because they needed to fit in with the society of the old denominations, the main lines. And so they pulled them back on women. And so there's this attempt that anytime you need to fit in a society, you need to go with what the larger culture is telling you to do. And Pentecostalism wants to be, in one way, they want to be not seen as just charismatic. They want to be seen as mainline.
And the Pentecostal people have existed in large measure on the margins
Yes.
of church culture and the larger culture. And I was telling somebody just the other day, we've never had a Pentecostal president. There's never been a Pentecostal believer on the Supreme Court. They haven't had national prominence. And because of this, they have tried, as you say, to be accepted by the wider culture in some ways. And they've
Yes.
tapped down all this, this freedom that they gave women 100 years ago.
Well, the reason they gave it at the beginning was the ability to prophesy was something that women have always had. And some of it had to be prophesy, meaning sometimes it'd be extemporaneous preaching almost. Sometimes the extemporaneous preaching got beyond just extemporaneous and they began to preach. And some of the society began to look down on that a bit.
Now here we are, two white men talking about
Yes.
this tradition, and one of the things that stunned me about the book was how all of the material up until the 20th century, all the material available was all written by men, and men generally speaking in places of power.
Yes.
And I have, as I've gotten older, I've gotten very uncomfortable with men telling women what to do in the church.
I agree. The more and more I went to school and learned, even though I went to schools that were complementarian at the time, I just became terribly uncomfortable. Like, how is it that these women in these classes are as smart as me? And I can think of a couple of them that were a lot smarter than me.
Of course.
And I was there with Sheila. I mean, she came right behind me. But, and why can't they do this? They're created in the image of God, just like I am. They have a special gift. Why can they have to hold their special gift in just because they're female?
Now, here is my question to you. I put it in my review. Why have the women allowed this to happen? Is that a fair question?
It is. They did not. If you're told, Dr. Moody, you're dumb, you're dumb, you're dumb, you're simple-minded, you're a temptress, you keep telling that over and over again, eventually you get beat down to a pulp and you don't have any desire to do it. And I think what has happened over the centuries is that men controlled everything in culture and society. They controlled all the positions of power, that women began to actually believe to some point that they are not worthy of doing this. And the men held all the power. They had the money. You could not own property if you were a female.
This is true.
And so they just went with it.
And I grew up during my teenage years in Murray, at the First Baptist Church of Murray. And of course, there were a lot of professors at the university in the church, but they were all men teaching at the university. There weren't many women back in the 50s and 60s teaching at the university. And that was true probably at Campbellsville as well.
I would imagine it is. I don't know if Dr. Hernandez was our first female professor in the School of Theology. I mean, she's my best friend, but I'm so glad she's here, but I think she might have been. And now we also have Dr. Jennifer Garrison that teaches for us. I think one of the reasons that I have often thought academically that women are just as good as men is that I was Dr. Karen Bullock's very first PhD student. And I was enthralled with her ability to teach and recall facts and her writing. And I knew immediately that she was excellent. And so I was her first PhD student. And another close friend of mine was the second, Bart Barber, the president of the SBC.
And you mentioned Sheila Cloffer a few minutes ago. She was the first female to teach at Georgetown in the religion faculty.
I had no idea. That is wonderful.
And of course, Georgetown has just inaugurated their first female president of the college. All of these are big steps forward.
We have at Campbellsville, we have our first provost right now, Dr. Donna Hedgepeth. as a female. And we're very excited about that. It changes the dynamics. It's nice for students, first of all, to see someone that looks like you.
Mm-hmm.
And then like the women, they looked and they say it was all white men. And like, well, what do I do? And now they see a woman in there, like, well, I can do that as well. And of course, she's excellent. She's a really good provost.
I reported last week here in the meeting house that Princeton Seminary just hired a black scholar as their new president. Happens to be a black Baptist from Wake Forest. But his election is part of a wave of schools, seminaries, divinity schools that are hiring both women and blacks to be deans and presidents all over the country. It's a very interesting development.
Well, I think it's a wonderful thing for the simple reason that they have wonderful minds, and they have been eliminated all these years because of gender and skin color. And they're like, oh my goodness, that guy's really smart.
Yeah.
She's really smart. Maybe we can get a different perspective.
That's right. We're going to take a break right now, and I'm going to play some music by the Hillbilly Thomist. That's a phrase out of a Southern novelist. But these are 7 Dominican priests that are going to sing for us today at the Grand Ole Opry. I'll be back in just a minute.
You can't gather grapes from a bramble bush or pick a fig from thorns. But what I like to be, oh, to be a good tree. So fall in the rocks on the beaten path. Some sink into rich soil, and from a tiny seed grows a good tree, like a cedar high and mustard wide, where all of the birds of the air can hide, find rest inside. Oh, good tree. The beetle bites, the black rot strikes, the weevil eats from the inside. You'll have your enemies. Oh, if you're a good tree. High and dry, some branches die. From time to time, a prune's required if you wanna be. Oh, a good tree. Even when I'm old, I will still be still full of sap, still green. It's what I want to be. Oh, to be a good tree. tree of death becomes a tree of life. So let it be. Only a good tree.
That's the Hillbilly Thomist, a musical group out of the Catholic Church. They met while they were all students at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., living at the Dominican House. Learned that they loved Americana music, bluegrass music, started singing together, and they were singing there at the Grand Ole Opry, would you believe? Now, it's interesting we can talk about these Catholic priests. We've been talking here in the meeting house with Dr. Joe Early, Campbellsville University, about the role of women and what the male scholars have said about women to women throughout the history to justify the subjugation of women. My favorite quote in your whole book, Joe, I'm going to read it to you.
All right.
On page 269. This is by a preacher named A.R. Funderburk. I had never heard of him.
I knew you were going to do that.
Quote, every man has a quantity of dynamite or its equivalent in him. The matches have, as a rule, been in the hands of the world's womanhood. End quote. I think that's such a great image. The men have all the dynamite and the women light the match and set them off, I suppose. This is a way of demonizing women.
Many ways, and that's just one of them. That's just one of the ways.
I want to thank you for writing this book. This is a fabulous book. I want to thank you for sending it to me. But I want to ask you, what's next on your agenda? What are you researching and writing? Or are you taking a break?
Well, my wife is working on her doctorate degree at the University of South Carolina. And so the workspace that I occupied for 7 years is now again occupied. So my space is gone. But right now, I'm going to take at least through spring break at CU to come up and to brainstorm some ideas. I have thought about possibly writing on who I would consider the father of the Jesus people, Lonnie Frisbee. I don't know if you have heard of him. Came out of the West Coast and all that. I thought about doing that. There's a lot on it, but not a book. I don't know. Thought about writing a biography. It's just nothing has struck me yet. Right now, I am just tired and thankful that I've finished.
Well, I remember you said a minute ago when you were talking about the process of writing this book, your wife was the one that said, there's your book.
Yes.
So you're going to have to listen to your wife when she tells you what to write on.
Well, right now, I'm afraid she would tell me to write on things that I am not educated enough in fields that she is studying
right.
to like, I don't know what that is, hon. You'll have to write that yourself.
That's right. Well, you said working at the University of South Carolina, you know, our studio is just outside of Greenville, South Carolina, so we're not far from Columbia, where the main campus is.
She's online. So.
Right, online. I understand. So I've been talking today with Dr. Joseph E. Early, Jr., professor of theology, church history, and ethics at Campbellsville University in Kentucky, Central Kentucky, a place I've been many, many times, about his book, his new book, Because of Eve, the Historical and Theological Survey of the Subjugation of Women in the Christian Tradition. Many of the women are still subjugated. You know, I played that video of those 7 Catholic priests.
Yes.
And Pope Francis has gone just about as far as he can go to empower women at the Vatican and all of their systems in the local parish, as far as he can go without actually ordaining them or allowing them to be priests.
He is at the edge of the cliff.
He's right there at the edge, isn't he?
But he's not willing to make that jump yet. If he does, it'll come out of South America.
It'll come out of South America, where of course he's from.
Right.
And
exactly.
That's great. It's so great to talk to you. Now, I know Campbellsville, I've been there many times, is very near the Shaker Village at Pleasant Hill. You've been there, I'm sure.
Yes, I have. Yes, many times.
I've been down there many times. And it's a wonderful restored Shaker Village. They started restoring it a little more than 50 years ago. I want us to listen to a singing service hosted in their village in their meeting house. Now, I want to say their meeting house was one of the main inspirations for the name that I chose for my program back in 1998. I want to play this and let everybody listen to this music and get a feel and a look at what the meeting house is. And I'll be back in just a minute with my commentary, and then we'll wrap up the show. Thank you, Joe, for being in the meeting house. Come back. We'll talk again. Write another book for us.
Well, I'll be down at Columbia, here in a few weeks for the Tennessee football game. Maybe we can catch up.
We didn't even talk about Tennessee. They play Kentucky this weekend.
I'll be there.
And the Tennessee-Alabama game. Did they play Alabama this year?
Yes, we did, and we beat them.
Oh, you beat them, and now you got to beat Georgia, right? Am I right about this?
No, Georgia is undefeated still.
I know.
But we got them in next week, but we can't overlook Kentucky.
I know. Thank you very much, Joe. Come back to the meeting house when you can.
Thanks so much, sir. Have a good night, and it was my pleasure.
Let's go to the meeting house at Shaker Village.
Tis a gift to be simple, tis a gift to be free, tis a gift to come down where we ought to be, and when we find ourselves in the place just right, we'll be in the valley of love and delight, where true simplicity is gained, to bow and to bend we shan't be ashamed, to turn, will be our delight, till by turning we come round right.
That was the choir at Shaker Village in the meeting house there, and I'm Dwight Moody with my commentary for today here in the meeting house. It's entitled, Given Up on Church. She's given up on church, a woman said to me about another person. I sat silent for a few minutes. I know a lot of people who feel that way. They've given up on church, not necessarily on God or Jesus or prayer, just church. They used to be as active as anybody in a congregation. Worship once or twice a week, prayer meetings, dinners, programs, Bible studies, vacation Bible school. As often as not, it's the committees that drive a wedge between a love for Jesus and a commitment to the church. But other things can get in the way of our enthusiasm for congregational life. Things like, congregational life itself, especially when we're trying to make decisions or we have to decide whether to receive people or not. The termination of employees has been an exit rationale for people in every church I've ever attended. Some combination of these drove one veteran minister out of the pulpit and away from God and Jesus, everything. He wrote a book entitled Goodbye, Jesus. I read the book. I reviewed it. I interviewed him right here in the meeting house. You can read my review and watch that interview at themeetinghouse.net. Not all exits are so dramatic, so book-worthy. Many people just slowly lose interest. When opportunity comes, like a move, a loss, or a pandemic, they say, enough is enough. I think I'll read the Sunday paper today at the coffee shop down the street. You know, we disconnect from lots of things this way, from clubs and teams, from causes that we once were fervent about, even our spouses. Life has many seasons, and moving from one to the other without drama is a good thing, a necessary thing, and sometimes an urgent thing. Church can become sick, distorted, toxic, and we need to get away from it. I watched a TikTok video this week about a person's journey out of the repressive environment of a church. She said, quote, "I never felt so free," she said about her departure. Quote, "For too many years, I tried to follow all of their rules about money and time, emotions, even sex. I'm glad to be out," end quote. But after that, I read an autobiography, a different story about church. Quote, "I love singing the hymns of the church and having scripture read to me in a church setting, hearing sermons that are truthful, thoughtful, and helpful. And perhaps most of all, I treasure engaging in holy communion with the Lord and with my fellow church members," end quote. There are a lot of people who feel that way, just not as many as there used to be. But maybe it's as many as there needs to be. Not everybody needs to be in church every week. There are other ways of being human and knowing God, of living with purpose and making a difference in the world. Or as we say in my little church, singing for joy and living with hope. Years ago, I bought a plaque that appealed to me. It hung on my wall for many years. It reads, "The kiss of the sun for pardon, the song of the birds for mirth. One is nearer God's heart in a garden than anywhere else on earth," end quote. God started with a garden, you remember. And the Bible ends with the scene of a garden, a river of life, nourishing the trees of life with leaves, the text says, for the healing of the nations. A sanctuary full of pews is not the only place where the tree offers the healing that we need. It may be one place, but it's not the only place, thank God. I have lots of places where I've experienced the grace of God, and yes, one of them is a church, even sitting in a pew with a bunch of cantankerous people. I hope you find your place, in church or not, in season and out, a place that helps you be the person you want to be, the person God created you to be. I'm Dwight A. Moody in the Meeting House. I'll be back in just a minute. But let's take a ride on the Swamp Rabbit Trail. Thank you for coming into the Meeting House this week. I'm Dwight Moody, your host. We've had a great conversation with Dr. Joseph Early of Campbellsville University. Last week, I talked to you about John Prine. I still have with me the program from the 2 evenings I spent in the Ryman Auditorium at the great concert celebrating his life. One of the persons that was on the stage both evenings, Sunday and Monday night, was the famous actor from Chattanooga, Tennessee, Leslie Jordan. Leslie Jordan. He was funny, he was cute, everybody loved him, we all clapped. He was just being himself, if you've seen him in any of his movies. Well, on this past Monday, he died. He evidently had some kind of medical emergency. He was driving his car, lost control of his car, and the car crashed, and either before or after the crash, he died. But here's an interesting thing, even as we mourn his loss, his death, the day before he died, which would have been a Sunday, I think, he made a video. I want to show it to you. He and a friend were sitting in his house, I think. The friend was strumming a guitar, and Leslie was singing an old gospel song, "When We All Get to Heaven." Let's take a look.
The trumpets of the Lord shall sound, and time shall be no more, and the morning breaks eternal, bright and fair. When the saved of earth shall gather over on the other shore, when the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. When the roll is called up yonder, 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 I'll be there. Been baptized 13 times just to make sure, 'cause I'm gonna be there.
Thank you, Leslie. Love that song. I grew up singing that song, as did many of you. Thank you for joining us in the Meeting House today. We've had a terrific conversation about women in the history of the church. Here in the Meeting House, we're doing our little part to empower women to take their rightful place among God's people. You can go to my website at themeetinghouse.net and read a lot of book reviews. You can watch this show again. Thank you for joining us. Joining us again next week for another visit, another conversation about religion and American life. I'm your host, Dwight A. Moody. Have a great day.